and welcome to the Kink Perspective. My name's Chris. I'm a psychotherapist and consultant. On today's show, we're going to talk about the messy middle of kink, right? It's that stage where the thrill of being new is kind of worn off, yet you don't really feel fully grounded in who you are yet. It's that space where many people land in, but really we don't talk too much about, right? But before we get into all of that today, I want to thank each of you for listening, for supporting the show. You know, if you're new here, welcome. If you've been with me for a while, I appreciate you staying and being a part of these conversations. Do me a favor, make sure you follow, like, subscribe, listen wherever you get your podcasts. If you're following me on Spotify, through the app, if you could do me a favor, rate the show 5 stars. This allows other people to find it, kind of puts the content out there. It helps people who may need to hear these conversations find it, right? And if you want to support what I do directly, you can find a donation link in the show's description. Every little bit helps keeps these episodes going forward. So, with that said, let's get to today's topic. What really happens when that thrill first wears off? And at first, it is the excitement of all of these new toys, the new language, right? Maybe even your first dynamic. But then comes the quiet after the storm. The rush fades, the honeymoon, part kind of dies off, and you're left asking yourself who you are here and what you actually want out of the lifestyle. It's that middle space that can start feel confusing a little bit, sometimes even lonely, but it's also where the real work begins, right? So first, let's get into the whole naming the experience. Let's start by putting words to what this messy middle actually feels like. For many people, the first sign is what I'd like to call identity drift. Many of you, maybe come into the kink world with very wide eyes, soaking up everything you can, or maybe you threw yourself into a dynamic and built your sense of self around it. But then that dynamic ends and the initial excitement dies off, right? And you're left staring at yourself in the mirror and wondering, who am I now without that frame around me? Now, this can be a little bit unsettling because the identity that felt so secure suddenly feels like it's slipping away. And that's what identity drift looks like. And another part of this stage is that creeping thought that maybe you've lost your edge. In the beginning, everything feels thrilling, right? That first flogger sting, the first impact scene, degradation, if you got to the point you were actually a year or two in wearing a collar. There's a reason I'm stressing that. Even maybe going to your first munch or dungeon party can feel really electric. But with time, that adrenaline naturally cools off. Now, psychologically, we call this habituation. Our brains are wired to respond strongly to novelty. But over time, the new becomes familiar, and what used to light you up may feel like a routine, and that can trigger doubt. You might start asking yourself, am I really into this? Do I even belong here anymore? Have I maybe gone soft? These questions don't mean you've lost your edge. They do mean that you're adjusting to a new phase of the experience. And somebody asked me when I posted this topic, what do I actually mean by comparison? So comparison also plays a role in the messy middle. You look around the community and it seems like everyone else has kind of figured themselves out. People are talking about what they're doing with confidence in their roles, their dynamics, even their preferences and fetishes. And here you are. You're kind of floating around somewhere in between, unsure of where you are at. You don't have really solid footing under yourself. Now, this is what we call social comparison, and it's really powerful. We tend to measure our worth by stacking it against others. The problem is that what you're comparing yourself to is a snapshot and not the full picture. People do project confidence even when they're still questioning themselves or questioning their dynamics, just like you are. Now, what feels like everyone else is, having some sort of direction in the way they're going, sometimes that's just what we call the illusion of certainty. Now, there's another part to all of this, boredom. Now, this is one of the most confusing feelings to name because kink is supposed to be exciting, right? When you start to feel bored, it creates shame, but boredom isn't a sign that you're broken or that kink has lost its value. It's a signal from your mind that the easy rush of the novelty is gone. Boredom often comes in before deeper curiosity. Now, instead of running after another quick thrill, boredom can push you to ask bigger questions. What actually fulfills me? What do I want beyond the intensity? Now, I remember when this happened to me, I don't know, I think I had just moved out of Atlanta at the time. I was up in the DC and New York scene for a little while, and I was actually asking myself similar questions. I remember one night I went out for a walk, and I was really kind of thinking about what do I want from the scene anymore, because this kind of hit me. Is the intensity even enough, right? But all of this drift, this doubt, this comparison, the boredom, can leave people feeling like they've somehow failed. But this is not a failure. This is a normal stage of development. And in psychology, we often talk about the difference between exploration and integration. Exploration is what happens at the beginning. You try everything. You take in as much as you can. You ride all the highs. Integration comes later, when the excitement cools down and you begin to sort out what actually fits you, what sustains you, and what you actually want to carry forward. That sorting process is the messy middle. So, if you find yourself here sitting with these questions instead of some sort of certainty, it doesn't mean that you're broken or your kink has lost its spark. It does mean, however, you're in the process of growth. And the rush of, that beginning was never meant to last forever. Honeymoon phases never last forever. No matter what anyone tells you, and no matter how you try to prolong it, it does not. What comes after is quieter. Yeah, I will agree with that. But it's also richer if you let yourself lean into it. So let's talk about the psychology of the middle. Let's look at what's happening underneath this stage from my point of view, right? Or this world that I occupy. Because what feels like drifting or even a failure often has a very clear explanation once you zoom out just a little bit, right? So we're looking outside the box down at what's going on. So the first concept here I want to talk about is what we call identity transition, right? There is a psychologist who wrote about the struggle between identity and role confusion. We usually apply that to adolescence, but the truth is we move through these smaller identity crises again and again as adults. When you first enter the lifestyle, you are in the exploration stage. You should be probably for about a year because you're really trying to figure out where you fit, right? You're trying on roles, you're learning the language, you're testing out the scenes. You might even say something like, I am submissive or I'm a top, and that really feels thrilling. But when the first wave fades or a dynamic ends, that question shifts and it becomes, who am I here really? That is not confusion in the sense of being lost. It's the natural part of growth. And you're transitioning from experimenting with roles into deciding what belongs to you in the long term. And then there is actually the science of novelty. Early highs are powered by our dopamine responses, the neurotransmitter linked to our motivation and our reward centers. So the first time you feel the sting of, an impact or step into a dungeon, your brain is firing in overdrive. Everything is new, and the novelty always brings a surge of dopamine. But the brain is built to adapt, and over time, the experience produces less of that same rush. And we call this habituation. It doesn't mean that you're no longer kinky or that you've lost your edge. It means your brain is just adjusted. And many people misread this sign as they need to chase more extreme experiences, but often what is needed is depth, not escalation. And I actually recall years and years ago, a couple, they were very prominent on social media. They were really big in the scene. They decided that kink just wasn't thrilling enough for them. And they really wanted to escalate. And they were into a little bit more extreme. But they felt that they were lost. And they got into something that ended up causing a very severe injury to the point that it caused them to withdraw from the scene, ultimately end their dynamic in a very sad way. But Instead of asking, where are we at now, they just rode from high to high. The reason why I can't go into any more depth about it, because I do respect their privacy. I've had interactions only with one of them. So it's not really my story to tell, but on a broader scope, that's kind of where things laid out. So that question became about, why didn't you turn inside of yourself to look at what you really want out of this? What do you want out of your dynamic, instead of just pursuing the next fetish or the next scene together? If this feels empty, it's never going to be fulfilling, right? So another piece I want to explore here is, and we need to name this, it's called grief and loss. Now, people are going to associate this with somebody passing away or, something of that extreme nature. It's not. When a dynamic first ends, or even when the early stage of the excitement closes, this creates a form of grief. And you might grieve the relationship itself, but often the deeper grief is for the version of yourself that existed inside of it. Now, maybe that was the first time you felt seen in a certain way. Maybe it was the first time you allowed yourself to surrender or take control. When that ends, it can feel like you've lost part of yourself. Grief is not a sign that you should go back, but a recognition that something meaningful has actually shifted, right? And then we circle back to comparison. Now, social identity theory tells us that we form part of our identity by comparing ourselves to groups around us. Now, in the lifestyle, this can look like scanning social media or other people at events and thinking that everyone else has all of this figured out, right? I get this question a lot. You seem to have it, figured out because you've been doing this for so long. I don't. This is why I still go to classes. This is why I'm still at events. This is why I still do things. I'm going to apologize now because it's like starting to really rain heavily. I don't know if you're going to be able to hear that, but if you do, I can't really edit it out. So I'll try to talk a little closer to the mic today. Go from there. Beautiful August weather, right? But again, not just because we think that people have these things figured out doesn't mean we need to stop ourselves. More often than not, they don't. They're still learning. Now, there might be people that seem sure of their titles, their lanes, their dynamics, right? But what you're comparing yourself to is the highlight reel, not the reality. Just like on social media, people project confidence while quietly questioning themselves. And you see this all the time. People write about it. They'll tell you, just because you see me doing a curated photo of some sort of millisecond snapshot of my life, you don't really understand what it took there. The stress and the anxiety of setting up the scene, the cost, everything else, right? So in this messy middle, the comparison trap is especially strong because your own ground feels very shaky. And that doesn't mean that you're behind anybody. It just means you're human. So when you pull all of this together, this identity transition, the whole novelty fading, grief over the endings, and this whole pull of comparison, you see how the psychology gives shape to the messy middle. And this is not just some random discomfort. It's a stage where your brain, your sense of self, and your community identity are all in flux. Now, most importantly, this is not just psychology in a vacuum. This plays out directly in how you show up in kink. So if you misread habituation, you may chase harder and harder scenes rather than asking yourself what you truly need to feel fulfilled. And if you don't recognize grief, you might jump into the next dynamic too quickly instead of honoring what you lost. If you let comparison drive what you're doing and you copy what other people are doing rather than discovering what fits your own style or values, right? You could end up really driving yourself out. And if you see identity transition as a failure, you might walk away altogether, when in reality, you're just simply in the middle of the ground trying to find exactly where you can land safely. If you can understand these stages, it's not about giving you answers, it's about normalizing the questions. You're not broken for asking who you are or feeling the edge kind of dull a little bit. You are moving from the thrill of discovery into the substance of integration. And that shift, while messy, is exactly how our real identity forms. Think about when you're an adolescent, right? You're a preteen, pretty much when we're still children and we're getting ready to get into our early teens. We're starting to discover independence, our identity, our friendships, who we are, who we want to associate with. And this goes on for about the next 15 to 20 years. So it's constantly changing. For the most part, I'm not who I was at 16, and there's still a lot of me who was, but my identity has changed. I'm still in a role where I help people, but that role and the facilitation of it has changed, and I've adapted to it, right? So let's get into this part where this is called why we don't talk about it, right? So why is this stage almost invisible in kink conversations? Now, a big reason is where the community focus tends to land almost all the time. And you can see this in readings, on social media, you can see it in videos, you can see it at dungeons, right? Most resources are built for beginners. We tell newcomers how to negotiate, how to talk about consent, boundaries, trust, communication, and these are never ending. I mean, there are classes after classes that are just ridiculously overpriced, right? If you're paying more than like 10 or 20 bucks to go and do this constantly, you're paying too much. I'm sorry, you are, but that's just an opinion, right? There are endless instructions to how to deal with toys, checklists, guides for staying safe. But on the other side, we elevate all these established voices, the educators, these authority figures, these kink leaders, and people who have been around for decades. And they stand as a lot of examples of what it looks like to be grounded and confident. But the in-between, that messy middle, hardly gets mentioned at all. It doesn't look exciting. There is no real dramatic moment. There's no new title. There's no shiny milestone to post about. It's quieter and it's awkward. And because it doesn't get talked about, people who land here often believe they're the only ones struggling with it. And that silence feeds the isolation and even shame. And instead of recognizing the stage as part of the journey, many internalize it as a failure. And then there's another layer to this, a whole layer of silence in the repetition of the community language. We circle again and again the same phrases: consent, trust, safety, right? It's like a broken record sometimes. We don't know what else to say. There are literally thousands of articles with millions of words written about the same thing. And that's all they say is the same thing. Sometimes with cursing, sometimes not, right? Now, I'm not saying these aren't important. Of course they are. They are the foundation, but the conversation tends just to stop there. Rarely do you hear anyone asking, what comes next after safety is established? What does growth look like after your first few years? And without that next layer, people end up with a script that feels hollow once that early novelty worn off, right? And this creates a real disconnect. Imagine showing up at a munch after a couple of years in the scene. You already know the basics of negotiation. You've heard the safety talks, 500 times. You lived through your first couple of dynamics. You're not necessarily an expert either. So where do you fit? What you often hear repeated back in the same entry-level content you already know, it can feel like there's nowhere to put the questions you're carrying, especially the ones about drift or doubt or the loss of thrill. This gap isn't just frustrating, it can be harmful, because when the community doesn't make space, and all our individual little communities out there around the globe, for the messy middle, people either fake confidence to fit in or they just leave. And both options cut them off from any type of growth that they're going to experience. Some people even double down on the intensity, thinking that the only way forward is to keep raising the stakes. But that's one story they've just seen repeated. And the truth is, what's missing is the conversation about integration, not just how to start, not just how to look seasoned, but how to live in that in-between stage and make meaning out of it for yourself. And talking about the messy middle gives permission to slow things down a little bit, to sit with the awkwardness, and to realize you're not the only one who feels unsteady. This silence doesn't mean the middle isn't real. It just means the community hasn't built a language for it yet. That's why naming it matters. And once it's on the table, people stop thinking something's wrong with them and start seeing the stage as, part of the becoming, part of the experience of the lifestyle, part of their growth, their evolution. So we need to reframe the middle. So when we start looking at the messy middle, not as a failure, but as a pause for integration, the whole picture begins to shift here. This is not a dead zone in your growth. It's the point where you stop running on pure adrenaline and start building something with real weight underneath it. Think about it this way. The early stage of kink is almost like the honeymoon phase in a new relationship, right? Everything is amplified. You're constantly riding the high of discovery, right? That sex is awesome, right? You're having sex 80 times a day. You're doing, 30 scenes a week with your partner because, my God, it's incredible, right? Every slap, every degradation, every water sport, my God, it's incredible, right? So the moment, though, we don't realize is that the honeymoon phase is never meant to last forever. You can try to prolong it. You can. You can create distance and create separation, but ultimately things will shift. And the middle is where you learn whether there's substance beneath the surface, right? We in psychology call this shift from exploration to meaning making. Exploration is important, but without integration, it just becomes one new rush after another. Integration is what turns the experience into identity. And that's what the messy middle gives you. This whole chance to ask, what actually matters to me here? And so maybe you discover while, group scenes were exciting at first, they don't actually leave you feeling fulfilled anymore. So instead, you find more comfort and depth in the one-on-one connection where the intimacy matters more than the crowd. Or maybe you realize you don't need constant play to feel valid. At the beginning, you might, feel pressure to be active. You're at the dungeon every week. You're at every munch. You're going to every, class you can get a hold of. You always have to show yourself. But in the middle, you start to see that your identity as a lifestyler, as a kinkster, isn't defined by how often you play, but how aligned the play feels when you do. And another realization here is people often have, in this stage, is that depth matters more than the novelty, right? Sorry, I'm just having some coffee. If you guys are wondering what I'm sipping on, I'm having coffee and water, so. But look, early on, it's easy to chase the next big scene or the next partner with a new set of skills. But after a while, you're going to notice that surface thrill is going to fade very quickly. And while connections that go deeper, that, to sustain who you are, that's what you're actually searching for. So you're going to either be going from high to high, and that new high is going to start fading quicker and quicker. So you need to start looking at going deeper to sustain yourself. And this is where you start building values instead of just experiences. You're not asking what excites me anymore. You're asking what sustains me, what feels authentic to who I'm becoming. And that reframing is powerful because instead of seeing the middle as boredom or doubt, you start seeing it as data. It's giving you information about what you need and what you value and what actually holds your attention. If the early stage was about saying yes to as many things as you could, the middle is about learning where to say no so that your yes has more weight. And here's the key perspective in all of this. The middle isn't a sign that you've lost something. It's a sign that you're clarifying something. When you realize you don't need to be at every event, that you don't need to be, have a pickup scene with every person. You don't need to live up to somebody else's lane. That's not giving up. That's agency. It's growth. It's taking control. It's the beginning of aligning the lifestyle and BDSM with your actual self, not just your projected self. So instead of measuring the middle by what's missing, the thrill, the novelty, the constant rush, measure it by what's forming. Are your values clearer? Do you have a stronger sense of what feels right for you? Are you learning to separate the external noise from your own internal compass? Those are the markers of integration. They often show up quietly, without fanfare. The middle, when reframed, is not a void to survive. It's a place where substance is built. It's where you learn that kink isn't just about the highs, it's about creating meaning and building values, friendships, grounding in the version of yourself that are going to carry you forward. So I got asked too when I started exploring this topic, well, how do I reflect? So some practical reflections here. How do you work with the middle stage in a way that feels practical, not just theoretical? All right, so I'm going to strip back a few ideas because I want you to kind of get an understanding of what you can ask yourself and what you can reflect on, but I'm not going to make this sound like, you're in a therapy session. So one is to pay attention to your patterns of engagement. If you find yourself constantly chasing events or scenes, but you're leaving very unsatisfied, step back for a second. Notice in yourself where the spark still feels real. That might be a small gathering, a quiet night with someone you trust, or even a break from active play. Give yourself permission to change your pace, right? Helps you notice what actually resonates rather than what you think you should be doing. And then another useful practice is to set small, intentional experiments. Instead of throwing yourself into a whole new role or style, test it out in a small way. Maybe go to a workshop, follow someone that you really respect, of course, with their permission, right? Talk to them about it. Watch a scene rather than just getting right into it. The middle stage is about clarity and small experiments that give you the information without locking you into something that doesn't fit. And conversations are another underused tool. Not every interaction in kink has to be about play. Some of the richest growth comes from sitting down with people and talking honestly about what this feels like. I've learned so much from so many different people. I've talked to both doms and submissives, mistresses, dominatrixes, bottoms, masochists, everybody in between. I have asked over the years how they've navigated their time in the scene. And then for you, this gives you the opportunity to share what you're noticing about yourself. These conversations reveal that you're not the only one wrestling with the drift or the boredom, right? And hearing that reflected back is really powerful because now you know you're not alone. And you can also start paying attention to how you spend your time outside of play. Who are you connecting with? Who do you invest your energy in? If kink is the only way that you feel alive when it's tied to the novelty of it, it can start to lose its meaning. But if it's part of a larger pattern of connection, learning, and authenticity, it begins to take root. So look at how kink fits in your broader life, not just your scene. And I'm going to give you an example here because of the people that I'm associated with. Now, although we get together for 4 big events a year, right, that are weekend long, we don't just get together for those events. We will have cookouts together. We've done trips on vacations together. There's a lot of us inside of this. And so we spend time getting to know each other. And it creates it's like a family type environment. I know if I've got issues about something in the scene, I can go and talk to them. I can trust their judgment. And I can maybe hear back from their experiences, right? It's wonderful feedback, but not everything I'm doing or I'm talking to them about. Sometimes somebody's going to be talking about, they're traveling somewhere to go see a sports team, or they're going to go and they want to go on vacation. They're not just talking about the scene. We're also extending our lives beyond it, right? The final piece on this part I want to talk about here is practice choosing your depth over repetition. Now, that can mean reinvesting into an activity you already enjoy, but learning it in a more full manner, right? Getting into the deeper roots of it rather than just chasing the next new thing. Sometimes depth looks like slowing things down or refining your skills or even building more trust with your partner, but it might not have the same adrenaline rush as your first time, but it's going to carry something the next time with more weight because you're going to be connected in a new way. Now, these aren't prescriptions here. These are reminders that the middle is not a dead zone, but a place where a deliberate choice matters. So if the early stage was about collecting the experiences, this stage is about selecting the ones that actually fit who you are. If you take nothing else from today, let it be this. Being in the middle doesn't mean you're stuck. It just means you're in motion. You may not feel the rush you did as intensely as you did in the beginning, but that doesn't mean the work is over. It means the work is starting to deepen. The messy middle is not the end of your story. It's a bridge carrying you from the spark of discovery towards something steadier and more grounded. It might feel uncomfortable, even lonely, but it's also proof that you're just not repeating the same patterns you used to. And you are moving toward clarity. So instead of asking if you've lost that edge, maybe the better question is whether you're ready to find that depth. Because this stage has less to do with, how exciting you look on the outside and everything to do with the foundation you're laying on the inside. That's the reflection I want to leave you with today. And here's the question. Where in your life or in your kink are you still chasing the thrill? And where are you ready to build something that lasts? Right? Something I want you all to kind of sit with and think about. Right? You'll be able to answer that in the comments below. Now, before I close my show, last week I started something new because I wanted to start explaining to people that for some reason I received some of the comments and the emails that I do. So I've created a new segment on my show. It's called You're Famous Now. And the longer you put your work out there, I've learned, the more visible you become and the more you end up as a mirror for people's projections. And some people don't really like what they see looking back. They take cheap shots, they nitpick, they throw insults, and because that's just easier than actually engaging with what anybody's saying. So I'm going to give you this week's highlights. I'm going to be putting an explicit warning because, I'm actually going to read these verbatim because I want you to know what I get. You can feel the intensity, and I'm actually toning some of these down. Not all the way, but a little bit. So the first one rocks in from the entitled Granny. And after some discussions, she said, your time should be free even though I never scheduled an appointment. You don't care about people. You're a fraud, asshole. That was pretty much how it ended. I didn't really kind of get that because she made a couple things very, very rigid. The next one was from the geothermal brat. I know more about the world than you ever will. Now, keep in mind, I think this person was like 26. You don't help anyone. Take your fake degrees and shove them straight up your ass. It's because I had commented on something. I don't know. And then some comments came back. But from Daddy Geo, her self-proclaimed master. Now, normally you help people, Chris, but how dare you criticize my brat? You crossed a line. Go fuck yourself. All right. It's just awesome. This one I got off of Substack because I had written some stuff for mental health, especially for men. Because you know what? I do write a lot. I don't write nearly as much as I want to for men, but I do write for men. This seems to upset some men. So, from the White Knight Warrior, you should never write anything directed towards men. They are the oppressors. They've held women down forever. And the fact that you don't see that proves you're mentally ill. Go F yourself. And then there was a lot more to it. All right. I could sit here and tell you that this stuff doesn't get under my skin, that I don't really want to retort towards these people. I do. There's a lot. This is why I enjoy the block button, because it pretty much says, they don't get any time on my page. But that absolutely wouldn't be honest. The truth is when you speak about really difficult topics or you're responding to, hyperbole that people is putting out there or emotionally charged stuff and they just want an echo chamber, you're going to hit people's nerves. And sometimes those nerves fight back with whatever they think is going to stick. Your tone, your style, your gender, your personality, anything but the actual content, right? But here's the thing, if these comments means that the work that I'm doing is hitting a nerve, I'm going to take them. I'd rather deal with the noise than stay silent just to keep some other people comfortable, because as a lot of you know, and I've said this before, I don't bend a knee. If you don't like what I have to say, you can tune out or you can stop reading. But I don't I don't attack anyone. I don't really talk about my opinions on certain things. But this is the type of stuff that is not quite daily that I'm receiving, but I'll tell you right now, it's coming in more and more, and I'm very surprised. It's coming in, pardon me, a little bit more often. And I'm not really sure, because I don't see these people, because I've looked at their profiles or I look at the things that they write. I don't see them actually doing anything for the community. They're not giving services away. They're very exclusionary, because if you don't go with if you don't get involved in their groupthink, then they are going to ostracize you. That's not kink. That's authoritarianism. And I'm not involved in that. I don't believe in that. Right? But hey, what would I know? Anyway, so that was this week's version of You're Famous Now. I do have a book out there. It's not a literary wonder at all. And I'm going to say it like this because, you all don't believe it. So if you buy it, right, buyer beware. Tangled Desires, the intersection between psychology and BDSM. Look, it does help a little bit. It explains some stuff. It's for kind of new people. It's got a lot of psychology, and it does repeat itself. Because, I thought that was needed at the time, and I wrote this a long time ago. It's not the greatest book. Never going to make the New York Times bestseller book. If you want it, wherever you get your ebooks, or you can get a print version, go grab a copy. You might like it. Worst case scenario, you got a new coffee holder, right? Or a coaster for your coffee mug, right? I'm not putting my own book down. I'm just, I have a friend who always tells me promote it, and I am, but I promote it in jest because when I used to be really proud of it, like people just like hated it, and it's hard to deal with hate, so it is what it is. But anyways, tell me what you think about the messy middle today. Let me know. I want to hear your thoughts and your comments. Have you been there? How did you get over it? Did you talk to anybody? Did you end up leaving the scene and maybe coming back, right? I want to hear about all these things. Let's help others that might be getting ready to enter it or who are in it right now and don't know how to navigate. Let's talk about that, right? Until next time, everybody, be safe and stay kinky.